are some short-term or even long-term illnesses that are very common from people who, don't get a good amount of sleep. And the reason for this question is maybe knowing of these things will deter them and try to tell them get better sleep.
Great question.
Yeah.
We are learning so much more about the effects on health of chronic sleep loss or chronically untreated sleep disorders like sleep apnea, like insomnia, for example. And what we're seeing really is that multiple systems in the body and multiple organ systems get affected by sleep loss and sleep issues. Most concerning one probably being cardiovascular disease. We're learning so many different things about not only sleep apnea, which we've known for many, many years is associated with cardiovascular risk, but even just like we said, chronic sleep insufficiency or short sleep duration has been associated with increased mortality, increased likelihood of developing problems like high blood pressure, for example. So we're learning a lot about the effects of sleep on various systems. I would say that the two biggest systems in our body that get affected by sleep issues are, in my opinion, the two biggest health crises that we face in the world, which are cardiovascular health and mental health. And sleep issues and sleep disorders play directly and correlate directly with both of these things. So the fact that we underestimate that at times is something that I think is something that we need to do something about, and that's what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly, right? Because I'm very interested in the world of sleep. I love to sleep so much. So quick tangent. When it comes to sleep, is there any genetic reasons why people have less or more sleep, or they're inclined to sleep disorders because of genetic reasons?
What an excellent question. Yes, actually there is. The genetic component of certain sleep disorders, and it really depends on what kind of sleep disorder or what sleep issue we're talking about specifically. But for example, insomnia, once again, the most common sleep disorder in the world. It's not a genetic disease per se, but it's something that often runs in families. I mean, ultimately, a lot of sleep issues, including insomnia, have a heavy behavioral component to them. And where do we learn our behaviors, right? The environment that we grew up in and the people that we grew up in. So you'll often see things like insomnia run in families. Even restless leg syndrome very often runs in families. Or people who have circadian rhythm issues, like, for example, people who are night owls classically. Not that being a night owl is a sleep disorder, but it's a problem if you need to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and you're a night owl who never sleeps before 2 a.m., for example. Even something like that very often runs in families in terms of circadian preference of evening versus day. So all that to say that many sleep issues have a genetic component to them, even though they're not necessarily inherited genetic diseases.
Okay, cool. So like kind of, if I'm understanding this correctly, the circadian rhythm is basically our internal clock. So basically someone who works night shifts has a flipped circadian rhythm than someone who works an 8 to 5.
Correct. That's right. That's one example of a circadian issue. Now, being a shift worker is in and of itself not a problem. I mean, obviously, many people are shift workers, and especially if they're able to maintain good sleep health, and fit that into this shift work schedule such that they're able to acclimate to being a shift worker, and now they're sleeping during the day and they're doing just fine. But it is very common for shift workers to struggle either with sleeping during the daytime or with being totally alert during their night shift. And in those cases, we call that shift work disorder, which is a type of circadian rhythm disorder, and we have different treatments and solutions for that.
I see. Now, something that we've talked about in the past, outside of this podcast, REM versus non-REM sleep. So REM, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, rapid eye movement. Non-REM is non-rapid eye movement. So what exactly is REM and non-REM?
We need a separate podcast now.
Briefly.
Yes, of course. So there are 4 stages of sleep. There's non-REM 1, non-REM 2, non-REM 3, and REM. Notice how sleep is literally differentiated or delineated between what is REM and what is not REM. It's because, number one, the physiology of REM sleep is very unique and very different from the rest of the stages of sleep. And not to mention certain diseases or certain sleep disorders exclusively affect REM sleep versus non-REM sleep. And vice versa is true as well. So not to get too sciencey with it, during rapid eye movement sleep, which is a very unique stage of sleep, we spend about 10 to 20% of our nighttime sleep in that stage. And essentially what happens during that stage is a few things. Number one, that's the stage of sleep that we dream, right? So vivid imagery is a big part of that. Additionally, our muscles are typically paralyzed during that stage of sleep. and only during that stage of sleep. Can you imagine what would happen if our muscles were not paralyzed at a time in which we were having nightmares and dreams? What would happen?
Oh, the people next to you would be waking up bruised and
That's exactly correct.
Yeah.
That's which actually that happens, and because this represents there is a sleep disorder in which that paralysis that's supposed to happen is not functioning properly. So now the person is acting their dreams out and hurting themselves and hurting their bed partner, and it's awful. But that's essentially these are just some examples of how different REM sleep is from the other stages of sleep. Paralysis, vivid imagery, a lot of the brain's recovery and sort of taking out the trash, as we call it, and cleaning of plaques from the brain occur during this stage of sleep. So that's REM sleep. And there are certain disorders, like we said, or certain sleep issues or sleep disease, sleep-related problems that exclusively affect REM sleep. One example is narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is a neurologic sleep disorder where a person constantly feels sleepy and has difficulty maintaining wakefulness during the daytime. And once again, not to get too sciencey with it, a lot of the problem in that condition is because their REM sleep is very unstable. So that's that. And then in terms of non-REM sleep, things like sleepwalking, sleep terrors, which in a child are usually benign and harmless, and kids just outgrow these
Is it
things.
when they like jitter in their sleep? Are those terrors, or is it like
Somewhat like that. Sleep
Okay.
terrors are essentially when you have a person who just suddenly rises from sleep, screaming, sobbing hysterically, looking like they're having an absolute nightmare, but they're actually not having a dream or a nightmare at all. They just look like they're in an absolute state of terror. They're not really fully asleep, but they've not really fully awakened yet. And that's a classic
they're in
sleep
limbo.
terror. Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
They're in what's called a state of arousal, which is what we call that sort of tangential space between sleep and wakefulness. So things like sleep terrors, or like we said, sleepwalking. Sleepwalking also occurs during non-REM sleep, which is why the sleepwalker doesn't really recall what they did at nighttime or where they walked. They'll very often wake up and find, the Dreyer's ice cream on the kitchen counter and not necessarily know how it got there, or Doritos bag is in their bed. Sleep eating is very common in sleepwalkers. And that, once again, represents, because it's not occurring in association with a dream, really what that represents is a person who is just exhibiting this automatic behavior that they usually do during the daytime, walking, eating, talking, even sexual activity, except that the brain is unable to kind of separate it out. And so it's occurring during this, once again, state of arousal. I don't want to get too complicated.
that reminds